Hello and welcome to Inside Infrastructure, an inside look at the decisions and decision makers behind Australia's city-shaping infrastructure. I'm Ilya Zak from PwC Australia, and I'll be joined for the main portion of the show by my co-host Adrian Dwyer, Chief Executive of Infrastructure Partnerships Australia. Recently, Adrian and I sat down with the Deputy Chair of Infrastructure WA and Westport Task Force Chair Nicole Lockwood to discuss her reflections on the Infrastructure Advisory Board model and Infrastructure WA's forthcoming state infrastructure strategy, and the trends and chief drivers behind the freight system overhaul in WA. Nicole also shares her views on why major reform has become so difficult and what needs to be done to shift the dial in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. It was a great chat, so here it is. Nicole Lockwood.
So Nicole Lockwood, welcome to Inside Infrastructure.
Thank you.
Now, maybe in the first instance, you could introduce yourself to our listeners and let us know who you are and what you do.
Well, obviously Nicole Lockwood. I've been for the last almost 3 years chairing the Westport Task Force, which has been a sort of a long-term planning exercise to look at the future of ports in WA. And I sort of hold a number of other infrastructure type roles. So I chair the Freight Logistics Council in Western Australia. I recently finished up on the board of IA after nearly 10 years, and I'm the Deputy Chair of Infrastructure WA. So, yeah, I've had a bit of an eclectic career to get me to this point, but, yeah, really enjoying being part of the long-term planning process.
Let's have a bit of a chat about that career that's got you to where you are now, because it has been, in the research we've done, probably a non-traditional career path to get to the, I guess, a sort of an executive chair type role you've been doing with Westport, and then the more traditional NED type jobs in the other area. Maybe you could just take us back a few years and talk about that pathway to where you are now.
Yeah, sure. So started out as a lawyer. I had a bit of a passion for the environment at the time, so kind of was thinking I'd end up in the environmental planning legal space. But as careers do, they take you in strange directions, and ended up moving up to Karratha for my husband's role. He was with Woodside at the time, and I was pregnant. So, you know, that's the one great thing of being female and having babies is you get the opportunity to stop for a minute and think about what you really want to do. And I'd been practicing for about 6 years in a range of different parts of the law and really didn't like any of it. Partly because I felt what I really loved was problem solving. And I think what the legal system's really good at is taking a problem away from someone and putting it into a new system and giving them an answer that they'd never even thought of and probably never really wanted. So I used to find it very frustrating being part of that structure, but the basics of what it's about, I think I still use today. So going to the Pilbara just gave me this amazing opportunity to take it back and really rethink what I was good at and what I enjoyed, and being up there at a time where, you know, it was in the thick of the boom. Pilbara Cities was birthed, and I ended up running for mayor because I was bored and wanted something to do.
I want to unpack that because there's a big step between I had some time during parental leave to think what I wanted to do to becoming a mayor of a frontier city in WA. So, I mean, I don't even know what question I should ask, but how did you go from parental leave to mayor?
Well, when I started, so I had the baby, didn't sleep. When I eventually started to wake up again and decided I actually did want to work, I ended up going to the community legal centre in town and thought, right, I could probably just volunteer here to give them a bit of a hand, and offered to do that. And within 2 weeks of starting, they had 4 offices across the Pilbara. All of their lawyers quit. So I was it. So they said, would you like to run the community legal service? And I'm like, well, that wasn't quite on the list. I was hoping for a little bit of part-time work around the baby, but yeah, okay. So I did. And what hit me was the dysfunction of that part of the world from a whole range of fronts. You know, you've got some of the, you know, biggest projects going ahead, you know, multi-billion-dollar projects, people getting paid a huge amount of money and then people having nothing. And you had, you know, families in town where, you know, the husband traditionally was employed by a resource company, and the marriage would break down, and then the wife couldn't leave town because the children were there, and the court would require her to stay, and there was no accommodation available in town. So it was quite a bizarre place. And then we had lots of issues, obviously, in Aboriginal communities at the time. That was at the point where Roban was in the spotlight. A lot of safety issues around housing. So it was a really strange and disturbing social setting, and I sort of thought, geez, this can't be right. You've got all this wealth and all this poverty in one place, and a system that's really ignored the Pilbara. You know, the state, you know, at that point, to be honest, it was seen as a catalyst for royalties, but that's about all. Certainly wasn't a place where people would want to go and live. So I kind of thought, right, well, I do want to give back in some form, and thought, well, maybe, being on council will give me a better understanding of how the place works. I had all these idealistic thoughts about how I could fix it. My big crusade was, let's get some more lawyers in town at the time. That was one of the platforms I ran on. And I had no network. We'd only moved to town sort of 6 months before, and kind of worked through, the one I did. I had a mum's group, and my husband was working obviously at Woodside, and then I'd started meeting people through the legal service, and thought, oh, well, I'll give it a run. And I ran against 5 blokes in their 60s. That kind of helped, because I looked a little bit different, and I looked like what a lot of other people look like in town. Young people with a passion and a willingness to try something different, come to town with a baby or young kids, and, willing to have an adventure. So I think that stood out, and I certainly took out all the votes and got a spot. So I thought, okay, well, that was fun. And I came home after my first night on, like, we had like an orientation type thing, induction. And I said to my husband, I want to be the mayor. And he's like, oh, for God's sakes, you've just got in. Can you just settle it down? And I'm like, no, this place there's so much that could be done here. I'd love to do it. Anyway, the first year I learned a lot, and then thought, oh, what was I thinking? This is a nightmare, and it's enormous, and I can't do that. And then in the second year went, no, actually I think I can. So I spent that kind of first 2 years on council learning the place and understanding how it worked, and then decided in the 6 months leading up to the next election that I'd kind of put my hat up for the mayor role, and got it.
So how does that work? I don't. My familiarity with local government is probably not what it should be. So you are a councillor, and then you run separately to become the mayor? Different
local governments are different. So in that local government, you are on council, so you're elected as a councillor, and then there's an internal vote for mayor. So you basically nominate, and then there's a vote on the night, well, basically the week after the elections. So okay. I had a 4-year term, so I'd done 2 years of my 4 years. So I wasn't up for election at that point, but the current mayor was, and I sort of just thought, right, I'll give this a go.
You would have been overseeing a pretty enormous city building program, and to some extent during your time there in the early 2000s. Is that?
Yep.
How does that work in a town like Karratha, where a whole mountain of the construction is done by the employers rather than the city? How does that look, and how is it different from other cities?
Well, I think it was really interesting in those first couple of years I was on council, because I kind of needed to understand, well, how does a place like this even come to exist? And it was a really, it's a really pioneering type environment. You kind of go there with an appetite and a bit of money, and you can pretty much do anything. It's quite exciting. And I think that still lives on, even with the companies that are there now. So looking back, when Karratha particularly was established, it was actually a partnership between the local government, it was a roads board at the time, and the company. So the state agreements were brokered between, what was a local community and the company coming in, and largely the companies built the town. So the town was like, right, these are the things we need, and Woodside and Rio and others came to the table and they built them all. So that was sort of at the beginning. And when we launched Pilbara Cities, I spoke, so that the Premier came up, and Don Volti was the CEO of Woodside at the time, and I spoke with them on the day about what the opportunity was. And the issue was that when these places were built, they were built for 40 years is what they thought the life of the iron ore deposits were. So that was it. It was sort of, okay, we'll build it and then we'll close it back down again, a bit like they did in the goldfields and other places. So, we're 50, 60 years beyond that at the point I was there, and nothing had been done. The state had sort of gone, oh, that's right, we've got some people up there, we probably should do something, which is what the Pilbara Cities was all about. It was, trying to create, settlements in a place where this area of the country has got such enormous wealth. Why is it not more populated? Why do we not, use it more? So that was what Pilbara Cities was about. And then I was the mayor of Karratha, and then I was also the chair of the Development Commission after that, the Pilbara Development Commission. And that was, that's where a lot of all that infrastructure build happened. Multi-billions the state government spent catching up really and preparing for the future.
What's your proudest achievement from that time?
Well, if you go to Karratha now and you look at photos of it from the planning point that I started and what it is now, it's totally transformed. So what I'm pleased about is that everything that we set in place in our planning documents and the projects we started, 10, 12 years ago have all now been delivered. And the place is it's got all the bones it needs now to be able to grow. And for anyone that travels, that part of the world is fairly uninviting, but it's a very, obviously physically it's been totally transformed, but it's got culture, it's got vibrancy, there's bars, there's restaurants, there's an arts scene that wasn't there when I was there. So that was what the legacy.
I talk to infrastructure people and people that do massive projects or roads, rail lines, what have you, and they often, you ask them like, what's the best thing about it? They'd be like, oh, there's a bike path we put in that really made the difference, or there's a piece of cultural infrastructure, or there was an Indigenous apprenticeship program. I just find it really interesting that infrastructure people that do really big stuff, the thing that really made the difference was like the cherry on top was the other thing they did alongside. It kind of sounds, you talk there about the vibrancy, the culture, that there are bars, and it's quite I don't know if that's just something about infrastructure people, or it's a
I imagine you were able to do a fair bit for the Indigenous community there as well as a result?
Look, probably not as much as I would have hoped. It was at a really interesting time, as I said, where a lot of spotlight on the region for all the wrong reasons. I remember having a lot of journalists ringing me wanting to talk about all the problems, and I said, no, I'm not really interested in having that discussion. I want to talk about what we can do differently and the solutions. A lot of money being, from resource companies going into social initiatives. But I think the last decade has brought out a different level of leadership and stewardship of some of that locally, which I think has improved things a lot. When I was there, it was still very much, really kind of grounded in that native title discussion, which is just the base of it. It's not really what the conversation needs to be about. So I think that was one of my regrets for the time I was there, that I couldn't do more in that space. And I think for me now, one of the things we're doing with Westport here is really using infrastructure as an enabler of economic development outcomes and social outcomes for Aboriginal people, which that's really exciting. And I don't think we got as far down that path up north as I would have liked.
And now you go from Mayor in Karratha, I think, did you move back to Perth after that? And then ultimately Infrastructure Australia. What's the bridge there?
Yeah, well, IA happened because of being in the Pilbara. So we actually had Infrastructure Australia come and visit when I was in the role. And I think the people at the time were just stunned by what was going on there and the scale and the fact that it was such a big deal. And it was right, the GFC really didn't hit the West until about 5 years later. And it certainly didn't hit it at the time it hit the East Coast. So I used to spend a lot of time on the East Coast, and all these, depressed boardrooms, people going, oh, how are we going to survive? And we were just, things were just happening in the Pilbara. So I think there was a real draw around that. And the other thing that was missing at IA at the time was a real understanding of the regions. So I joined the board then quite early on. And for me, it was an amazing opportunity to bring some of that thinking to a national context. A lot of people didn't even understand where the Pilbara was. So, there was a lot of conversations federally about what exactly is this and why is this important? So that that improved over time. So IA kind of became a constant for me right through my time in the Pilbara, then moving back to Perth and then going into the roles that I've got here. And I suppose the shift back was a difficult one because I'd sort of created a bit of a name and a profile for myself around a role that I was going to leave behind. So I had to reposition, and I came back and I worked for KPMG for nearly 3 years in their management consulting team, leading their government practice, and that gave me an opportunity, I suppose, to find my feet back in the city, largely still in the infrastructure space, and then decided to go out my own because there was a lot of opportunities that needed some leadership that maybe the public service didn't have internally, but they were looking for people to do that, and that's what I've been able to do over the last 5 years.
Can we talk a little bit more about the time in IA? You know, one of the originals, as you mentioned, there for 10 years on the board. How have you seen the? I don't know if you're more comfortable discussing it now, maybe than when you were still there. But how have you seen the organisation's role kind of change over that period? Because it did go through some pretty fundamental changes, but a couple of times, I think, in that time.
Yeah. It did. Well, it changed physically. The structure of it and how it functioned within government changed. So it went from sort of more, I suppose, an aside almost to the department to now an independent body. So that in itself was a big shift. I think some of the losses of that transition, the old model, the benefit of that, you did have a lot more people around the table from states and the Commonwealth. And the benefit of that is that you get to bring people on the journey with you. The difficulty of being totally independent is, you are sitting out on your own a fair bit, and you've really got to build those bridges back in. So whilst maybe, the opportunities for reform weren't as aggressive because you're trying to work within a system, I think that blended model has a lot of merit, and that's certainly the model that we've got at Infrastructure Western Australia now, which I think is a good thing. But in terms of the agenda of IA, I think that shifted a lot too, and it needed to, because the original purpose obviously was set up to deliver the nation building fund, which dried up pretty damn quick. And for most people, they went, oh, there's no money now, so I'm not interested in talking to you anymore. So it was trying to create a reason for being that wasn't about a bucket. And that's usually what all conversations with government are about. Is there a grant or is there a bucket? Then I'll have a chat with you. Not, are we actually here to talk about a long-term pipeline and partnership.
Do you think they should have the bucket?
When I was around the board table, we often used to say that, leave a little bit for discretionary and let everyone, commit to the things that they're passionate about. But there is a large chunk, and I'd go so far as to say 80% of the infrastructure spend that should be non-negotiable. It is just the right answer in the next, period of development. I definitely don't think it should be politicised. But
and is that applicable to the other I bodies?
I agree. I think everywhere that's infrastructure, full stop. But that doesn't necessarily fit with our political system. So you've got to be real in that. And then I think that's what IA has started to achieve over time, is when you can create a narrative that's robust and and I suppose open enough, you actually can create that outcome without having to hold the levers. So the transparency around the plan and the pipeline and the project list, and then the public debate that goes on about have we got the right projects, that is actually more powerful than having a body make all the decisions, because you've got people to buy in. Now, we're not there yet because there's still a lot of debate about the pipeline and what should happen when. But I think that
you mean IWA or we IA?
No, as in Infrastructure Australia,
right,
on its journey. And I think the state bodies have started to take on that the legacy, I think, that IA has been able to create. Remembering that when we started this process, states weren't even producing business cases at all. So we're going from great ideas at a cocktail party through to something that's actually documented, now through to something that's actually got some level of rigour. So that journey over probably a decade was significant in itself. Now we're talking about tweaking at the edges. Before we were talking about, can you even prove that this is the right idea? So I think that in itself is a massive achievement. Now it's about what value can you add that's not just adding more layers to the system. Where is a body like IA or the state bodies, where are they really going to have impact?
So can I just drill down a bit? It strikes me that to some extent we ask the likes of Infrastructure Australia to do an impossible task. We say you don't stand between a jurisdiction and a bucket of money, but we're going to ask you to mark their homework, for which they get ostensibly no benefit for you marking their homework. The best outcome is that your homework gets a tick, and everybody says, well, it should get a tick because it's your job. Worst case scenario is IA's rolled out in front of the media to say they haven't done their homework properly, and then they get beaten up by the states.
You're not referring to any specific examples there, are you, Adrian?
No specific examples at all. Just a generic conceptual example, Lydia. Is it the case that we're just setting? I'm specifically talking about the projects piece here, rather than the policy piece, which it does, which is more sort of
advisory,
kind of being a totem of what's right and forcing governments back to the mean over time. But on the project piece, it's quite adversarial. You're essentially marking someone else's homework, and you sort of send them out to get a kicking in the media and elsewhere. Are we asking them to do an impossible task?
I think the short answer is yes, and I think that's the struggle IA now has with state bodies in each jurisdiction to work out what's their role now. So when there was no state bodies, it was a different role. Now that we've got them everywhere pretty much, and that's what we're grappling with at IWA now. What's the value add at each level, and how do we make this, it almost becomes like a peer review then of a state process rather than a one-off. And I think the benefit is in the network that's been created both by IA and the bodies to really lift this to the next level and use each other and partner on best practice. This is now, we're beyond, getting the basics in place. We're now starting to think about, particularly if you look at the assessment framework and its limitations around the regions and around projects that are not traditional, transport projects that have can potentially have high BCRs. How do we make this more real for actually the complexity of the task? So I think that's the reason IA needs to pivot, because it can't keep doing the same thing. It's not actually going to get any accolades anymore from sitting there in that role. It needs to be more mature and more sophisticated in its approach.
But just to confirm, if you had to choose one, if you could choose any change for them that would address that issue, it would be that they decide what projects get money. Would that be the most effective way for that to happen?
Look, I think, the Commonwealth bucket's the biggest bucket. I do think if there was an ability to have a final vet on what happens when, that would be far more powerful than the role it plays at the moment, definitely.
I guess the natural evolution from talking about Infrastructure Australia is to talk about Infrastructure Western Australia, because you're of course deputy chair of the body, but you were heavily involved, I guess, in the advocacy for it to be established and the input into its structure, its role, and the outputs that it is now in the midst of producing. So maybe you could just talk to us, perhaps with reference to the learnings from the Infrastructure Australia experience, actually how that manifested in a state body.
Yeah, great. And I think that was part of my frustration for the first probably 7 years I was on IA was, the difficult reception I had at a state level. So I'm not there with a hat on for Western Australia, but I'm certainly there trying to help Western Australia get its act together, and very, very, very difficult process, because at the time, our state government wasn't in a process of long-term planning and system thinking. It was about some pretty big projects, and they're good projects, but it didn't really accord with the thinking that IA was putting out. So I was very passionate about creating something like IA at a state level, and as you say, spent a fair bit of time, particularly in the lead up to the last election, putting some papers together and trying to look at the other models too, because I think having something in form is one part, but it's actually how, in substance, what it does that matters. And I looked at some of the other examples around the country, and I was concerned that the way they'd been set up maybe undermined their effectiveness. So I thought, making sure that one, we had one of these, and two, it was set up properly was important. Otherwise, best not to bother. And we watched, certainly watched iterations of other jurisdictions needing a couple of goes before they got it right. And often it mattered what the mandate was. It mattered the political clout that it had, who it reported to, and who led it. So there was some really important pieces that we needed to get right. So for me now, looking at what IWA has become, it's a fairly pure model in the sense it's not doing delivery, which I think is important to keep that out of these bodies. I know other jurisdictions have taken that, and usually, when you're doing a good job, you get given more jobs to do. But I think that starts to blur the lines a bit of how they're going to be independent and transparent. I think IWA is really wrestling with this independence versus influence debate, which I think IA has struggled with probably more so since it's gone to a fully independent board. Benefit, as I said, we've got the blend of directors general plus independent board members, which is helpful. And now, the question of the audit and the plan, and then the list, sort of gone for a hybrid of that in WA, where we're doing a state infrastructure strategy, which then will build into a list over time and an assessment function. The difference, and I was sort of wasn't quite sure how it would feel to go from IA to IWA. The difference is that you've got a lot more levers. So at IA, you are there overseeing. There's a couple of things that the federal government have control over, but largely what you're commentating on, you've got no control over. So it's quite a difficult task. Whereas at a state level, one, the legislation we've got here actually mandates that all state agencies come into the tent, hand over their documents, and then when the recommendations come out, change their plans to match. So the power in the legislation is significant, whereas you just have none of that nationally. And that's quite frustrating, because you're trying to use, your influence for all it's worth, and your public brand, really. How much of the private sector and others can you get behind you to push an idea to get states to almost be guilted into doing it rather than doing it because they want to? So I think that's the benefit.
It's all Adrian, it's all relatively new, I guess, as you've described. And I think you're up to, with that state infrastructure strategy, you've just released a discussion paper.
That's right.
Can you talk us through where the discussion paper fits into the overall process of the strategy, and what kind of key issues you've focused on there?
Yeah, sure. So we've, again, 20 years looking out. We've cut it by region and by sector. We've got all the sectors at our disposal. So like others, we've got all the social infrastructure as well as economic, which is a pretty powerful landscape to look at. The biggest challenge we have in Western Australia is the regions. We've got this very, very consolidated population base in Perth, largely. Even the southwest is not overly populated. And it's a wicked problem. If I reflect on my time in the Pilbara, we had a great vision. We had an amazing opportunity economically, jobs, all the rest of it. Do you think you could get people to move there? No. They'd wanted a FIFO before they'd moved there. So, there's this issue of we haven't done what Queensland's done in terms of lots of population bases, quite large ones up the coast. We've got these tiny little dots all over the state. And from an infrastructure point of view, it is very, very difficult. And going forward, is that the answer? And that's one of the big things we've got to come to grips with. For us, water is another massive one. We've got a very critical problem with drying climate. We use a lot of groundwater. What are the long-term impacts of that? So where we're trying to take this strategy is really trying to catalyse what are the enablers for long-term growth? Not what's all the million projects we could do, but what are those sort of spines of infrastructure that are going to mean. So telecommunications is another massive one. And if you look at COVID and what we've learned, huge pivot on both health and education around technology. Biggest issue for us is the quality of our telecommunications across the state. So interesting time to be having the discussion, because we drafted the discussion paper pre-COVID, then kind of reflected on it through COVID and went, actually nothing much has changed except we've just turned up the dial. And in fact, when we talked about resilience, we weren't thinking pandemic, so we probably should add that. But pandemic is resilience everywhere, which is kind of interesting, because normally we think about point source impact rather than, universal impact. So that's been quite interesting. And I think too, now we've been out on the road having sessions with a range of different stakeholders, and people are excited because we're talking long term again. We're out of the minutiae of the day-to-day of reactivity of COVID. And I think they're realising we've got to think differently, and we might not get this opportunity again. So it's been very receptive.
So has it been mostly, it sounds like you're focusing on the projects that can enable sort of the economic resilience of the regional areas. Does the strategy also look at non-capital reforms or interventions that might help along that way as well?
Yeah, so our legislation is very broad, which is helpful. So we can look at policy and regulatory levers as well. So again, coming back to technology, there's an opportunity there really to rethink how we deliver services. Similarly in water and power, there's some commentary needed about the market we've got in Western Australia, and is that working or not? Is that actually stimulating the right level of investment? Is it actually helping with behaviour change or not? There's a whole area around waste. Again, what are we doing? What targets are we setting that's stimulating investment or not? So there's quite a lot for WA that's actually more around the context rather than the infrastructure itself. And I think, we're pretty keen to go there. Sorry?
Any previews of what's going to make it into the strategy? Any big reforms?
Not yet, because we're literally just in the throes of, working them through. But, technology and disruption and automation and all these things, how do we totally look at our networks differently? What are the policy levers we can use there around congestion that we've watched through COVID? We've suddenly just changed our whole congestion modelling, because suddenly people don't go to work at the same time or school at the same time. So, we've just shown ourselves we can do it. Everyone thought it was impossible. I don't know what the appetite will be, but we'll certainly be putting it out there.
I just want to step back just briefly and offer a comment on a question Ilya asked earlier and get your views on my comment. Ilya said about the eye bodies was the answer to giving them some degree of funding power, or at least a negative funding power. My reflection on that would be, we would be helping Infrastructure Australia, for instance, to do its job if we moderated that independence piece and went back to having a couple of influential secretaries of departments on the IA board, so that it had an umbilical cord back to Canberra, that it had it knew, it had an insight into government's priorities, but it also had an advocate for the role that at least independence of thought, if not independence of structure, can help the politicians. So my answer to Ilya's question is, I think it's impossible. I don't think that we will ever, or I think it's highly unlikely we'll see our political leaders cede power for funding to bureaucrats, and I actually don't think that's a particularly welcome outcome. I think we should, there should be people that face the electorate every few years. Do you think that kind of model where you had a moderation of independence in favour of more influence would help these bodies more to be more influential and therefore have net better outcomes?
Oh, totally. And I think that's why, for that reason, the board structure is critical, because having the connection in, whether it's even secondees into the organisation, so that you've got the conversation happening and you're working through the barriers as they emerge, because there are reasons why people or organisations resist things. And it's understanding what they are, not just steamrollering through. But the other thing that the IWA legislation has that I'm not sure others have is basically what happens is strategy gets developed and then recommendations get put to government. The government's got a period of time, 60 or 90 days, they table it, and then they've got to come back with their response. And then they've got to develop a 10-year infrastructure plan. So at the moment, we've only got a 4-year forward estimates period that people can see. This will take it out to 10. And then every agency has to go and change their capital works programs to match that 10-year program. So in a way, it's creating that without IWA needing to dictate it, but by embedding the system, the rest of the bureaucracy and the planning process folds in around it. And I think that is really powerful.
And the other thing that came up in conversation was water. And you were on the Water Corp board for a period of time, is that right?
I am still at the moment, yep.
Striking thing here happened this week is that Warragamba Dam is full. Warragamba Dam spilled earlier this week after having been less than half full 12 months ago, and big rains in the sort of late summer period, and 100% full. And Sydney's total storage now at, I think, 98, 99% full. The drought didn't break. The Millennium drought didn't even break over in the West. And you're on 2 desal plants now running at full tilt and talk about expansions.
With two in the planning. Yep.
Is it, presumably the assumption is that the drought will never break in the West, and
well, so the strategy is basically climate independent. So it's no reliance on dams. So a number of our dams are actually used to store desal water. The amount of runoff that we get by the time you get a decent rain and that soaks in, and then you get runoff, you get very little. And if you just look at the trend lines, it's frightening in terms of the downward trend of what dams are providing. So we are blessed with aquifers, but the long-term environmental impact of that is still being understood, and we've certainly seen it in the short to medium term. So there'll be a gradual pullback from the regulatory agency around water licensing because of managing that impact. So, the big challenge for Western Australia now is, how do we look at the whole water cycle? So thinking of water as a single-use resource is very, very yesterday thinking. And with other parts of the world, clearly it's recycled and recycled again. And, there's lots of stories about what the Thames is and other parts of Europe. But, that's where we need to go. And we've got technology already now that's taking wastewater, it's treating it and it's putting back in the aquifer. So it's one step less than potable. That seems people are comfortable with that. It's going back in the ground and coming back up again. We need to retreat it because it's got a few other contaminants, but we're there. All we need to do is plug it back into the pipe and suddenly you've got the closed system. So it's all about the community conversation, and it's about people getting comfortable with the idea that this is the way we need to use our water, like we use a lot of other resources now, multiple times.
Is this going to cost more money
less money? Is it going to come from the user, or is it going to come from the taxpayer?
Well, we're already on desal, and desal's not cheap. So, when you've shifted the whole economic picture, we're not, the part of the problem with water is it's not seen as a resource. It's not like mining where you pay royalties for it. If we started putting a dollar figure on water, then, hey, this is really cheap. So that's our issue. And even the water licensing for agriculture, there's a whole question there, and the whole country needs to have the conversation, but we've had to have it first just because of where we sit in the climate picture. So I think innovation can mean it's not any more expensive. In fact, we're reusing a waste product. It should actually in time be more efficient.
Can I ask one other thing about just to the discussion paper? There's been a lot, because you mentioned that you guys have done a lot of thinking about what COVID will do to the strategy, and all the states that have done equivalent strategies are bringing forward a mountain of expenditure as a stimulus measure. Do you think that there's any risk that is WA going to do the same thing? Is that part of the strategy to bring forward some of that expenditure? And B, is bringing all that expenditure forward a sustainable thing to do, or are there other things that can be looked at as well as part of the strategy? Maybe using the urgency of the situation today to look at some of the other changes that need to be made.
So look, we've had to be really clear with everyone in our network that we're not here to deal with COVID recovery. There's a separate part of government that's been established to do that, and there's, well and truly the government's on a trail at the moment announcing a whole range of initiatives. I think it's 5.5 billion they've put towards recovery initiatives, and they're largely in the sort of 1 to 3 year time frame. So for us with a 20-year strategy, it's important, but it's actually not material because the long term, is a lot different than that. But what is important is what has changed for us and our assumptions that mean there's a new opportunity or there's a different challenge. And with all this, bringing forward of new projects, what pathway has that now put us on? So we're just about to do a range of scenario planning about some different futures and looking at, given we've got the ability to bring all of the current government planning to the table and actually map it, what I know will be true is there will be a whole heap of it that's going to actually conflict with other parts, and there will be big gaps because no one's actually ever looked at it as a whole before. So this is our opportunity to say, well, we thought the planning frameworks and everything we're doing said we're going to end here. Actually, when we put the pieces of the puzzle together, we're actually over here. Where do we want to go? Well, actually probably over here. So what do we need to do now, maybe in the next 5 years, to turn the dial and take us in a different direction? And I think one of the opportunities in terms of built form and urban environment is, what does a modern COVID-proof, pandemic-proof city look like? And one of the things Perth has the opportunity to do, we haven't gone down the Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane path yet. We're trying to, and weren't getting there from population perspective. What's a different way of building a city with density, but without all of the risk that's coming with, a lot of high rise and very close proximity living? And could we actually be, the next evolution of what urban development looks like, and what is the infrastructure solution to connect that?
It doesn't sound like there's much that IWA is taking on a role of how to pay for what is going to be an enormous expansion of infrastructure delivery. Have I understood that correctly, or is that it's just not in your remit?
Well, it is, in the sense that there's a section of our legislation that talks to deliverability. So we need to have a mind to the cost impact and also the way things can be funded. So we won't be dictating to government that this is what they should do and this is how. But if we come up with a wish list of strategies and ideas that's never going to be achievable, then no, that won't meet the task. So we do very much need to think about what's achievable.
Let's move on to probably the job that's keeping you the busiest at the moment, in addition to all the others, is the Westport Task Force. And maybe just an open question, really. What is the Westport Task Force? What have you done? What's the journey to where you are today and the recent announcement?
Yeah, so we were set up almost 3 years ago now. And it was the first time, so the state government has attempted in various forms port planning. We've mapped 8 different times they've done this. And they've got to a point in the process and they've never actually made a decision to move forward. So we were determined not to be the ninth dot point on the list of exercises that never went anywhere. The difference with Westport to past processes is twofold. One is it's the first time they've ever allowed the whole system to be analysed in one step. So our mandate was port, road, rail and intermodal land or other logistics land.
And what's the problem you're trying to solve?
So the problem is our major port at Fremantle is based in the centre of, like physically the centre of the city. It's largely now being squeezed out by urban encroachment and general traffic. And it has a shelf life in terms of the berth structures and the port itself that needs to be need to consider whether you would invest again to basically rebuild those facilities. They're over 100 years old, or do you look at something new?
Is that a natural constraint there, or is that as a result of the urban development? Because I've been there, yeah. It's a beautiful gentrified area that's right next to the port. But was that is that a failure of planning that's resulted in that, or was it always going to reach capacity to, sort of where it's at now?
Well, I think it's that question of, when something was planned 100 years ago to be a sailing ship port at the mouth of a river, was that ever supposed to take the scale of what we're after? And my argument would be no, you don't try and evolve that forever. It serves a purpose for a time, and then you need to look to something different. So I think it's served its purpose beautifully, and as you say, it's created all that atmosphere and whatever. But if we are serious about long-term population growth, the scale of the task and the network that connects it will never support it. So it's just always been a question of when. And unlike Victoria, that's had a blue and a red port option, we've always had one location really that everyone said, yeah, we think that's the right spot. Still contentious, but it's more been a question of, well when do we get on with it? So we got given three options.
It's more analogous actually to Sydney Airport, Sydney Second Airport, because you had this. Everybody agreed. Everybody's in the know agreed that Badgerys Creek would be the next airport. It was the corridor, the site was preserved. And then there was 30, 40, 50 years of pontification about ruling out other options that were never viable. And then ultimately decided. It strikes me it's quite similar to that with the port, that the current port's going to be full. And actually there's a few different scenarios, but there's only one place the new port can be.
So where are you at in the 30, 40, 50-year debate? Where are you up to?
Well, we've had that too. We probably had 50 years of the same. The difference here is the corridors aren't protected. So that's sort of step one. And the work we've just done, and you're mindful of the fact that it was done pre-COVID and some of the assumptions now need to be tested. But at the outside, we know that big ships are coming, and we're saying maybe mid-2040s, they're going to be problematic for Fremantle. And around the same time, Fremantle needs to be rebuilt. And somewhere between the mid-2030s and then we're going to have issues with the network. So we're sort of saying we've got 10 to 15 years probably of time to get ready and get prepared for a new site. But the work we've just announced last week basically says new port in Kwinana, new freight corridor that connects directly from the port gate through to another major connector at Tonkin Highway, and land and rail and others to support it.
And what happens at Fremantle?
Well, we're at a point now where there's two transition options. One is basically a shared port option for a period and then a full transition, or a single stage step. The market's sort of starting to say, look, you don't share it, you just move the thing when you're ready to move it. We initially had a shared port indefinitely as from an economic point of view, and that definitely didn't work. So then the question is, well, you look at that site and what it offers. It's prime land. It's, that very much is analogous to Darling Harbour, Barangaroo, Botany, if you think about that shift. So we're just 20, 30 years behind that. What that offers for Fremantle in terms of a whole new lease on life is huge. It's a big site. It will take time and it needs to be done well, but I think, massive opportunity.
Does the football team have to be renamed after that?
Well, they never put their site in Freo anyway. They're out at Coburn, so yeah.
I am curious though how you've mentioned some dates out into the middle of the century effectively. Can you give us maybe just concisely what you view as the chronology of steps here, when you expect something to be built, when you expect something to be closed, and when you expect something to be shifted?
Yeah, sure. So again, as I said, the trade forecasting, was basically projecting out a rate of about just over 3% growth. So on that basis, and with the density targets we had in and around Fremantle, the congestion coming into the corridor, both road and rail actually, because we've got constraints on both, around the early 2030s was becoming problematic. So the work basically says, get started now, and do your planning, your corridor protection, your environmental approvals, get all that moving, and be ready to basically have a new facility operating by 2032. So that's the first date, either as a single step transition or as a shared forward option. If there was a shared option, then Fremantle remains in place, again, as we said, till probably the early 2040s, mid 2040s, when those other two triggers start to hit, or until the network issues connecting Fremantle become problematic in the meantime. Now, given what COVID's done, and we've pretty much stayed flat year on year over the last 2 years, even with COVID. But if we either saw a flatlining or a dropping off, then all that means is that 2032 just pushes it out a bit. So it's largely dictated by obviously growth of containers and growth of passenger traffic are the two catalysts in the short term to move the facility.
And what's the government said?
So they've supported our work in its entirety and have committed $97 million to the next 4 years of planning and corridor protection and environmental approvals. My view is, doesn't matter when we need it, if it's 10, 15 or 20 years, if we don't get this corridor sorted now and if we don't start doing the early environmental work, it won't be an option. So, and we don't really have a plan B. Fremantle can be developed further out into the ocean, but all you do is you just continue to constrain. We did look at Bunbury as an alternative, but unfortunately there's a layer of basalt at about 14 metres in the basin at Bunbury that would need to be blasted, and the dollars and the environmental impact on that is eye-watering. So it basically fell away as a large-scale terminal option.
To draw out the analogy or the symmetry with things like Western Sydney and there's other nodal infrastructure that are examples of this. We talk about the piece of infrastructure, the port, the airport, whatever it may be, and then over time it turns out that the supporting infrastructure costs many multiples of the nodal investment. But you considered the whole piece, including the connections in the work that you did, and put that into the economic modelling, etc. Can you just talk us through?
That's right. And I think that's what threw people a bit at the shortlisting stage. We had Fremantle as a long-term option in there, and when you did the comparative numbers, even at the first round of MCA, so they were a bit high level, we said about $4 billion for a port and road rail connections for a new port, and about $8 billion to keep Fremantle. And that was for exactly that reason. So not only have you got to rebuild the facility, you've got to create very large-scale upgrades to roads that are really not designed to have that scale of traffic. And a number of them, because it's one thing to just manage cars. People say, oh, well, it'll get solved anyway because the cars will need to be accommodated. I'm like, have you been to Sydney lately? No, it doesn't get solved anyway. There's an economic driver in freight that might make it get solved, but without the freight, congestion is congestion. So what our mandate was let's work out how to get that out of there, because if your productivity is based on travel time, and it actually doesn't really matter how many trucks you've got on there, it's all about how many cars you've got around them. You can't affect that without some serious policy levers. So, and the other thing for us is, yes, we can't tunnel the way you guys can on the East Coast. We don't have the right geotech. Well, you can, but it's very difficult, and we've had some pretty difficult processes. So, then you're like, well, if we can't tunnel, it's all about corridors, and no one's going to take out a row of houses either side of a major road right now. So if that's not the option, then what are we doing? Double stacking, and is that what you want in the middle of your urban environment? It's also an amenity question.
But more broadly though, WA has, I would say, of all jurisdictions, probably got the most sophisticated strategic planning frameworks over time. There has been corridor preservation. There is a fund that sits within government with a levy that acquires strategic lands on a very forward-thinking, like decades ahead type basis, and also a planning system. I think because of the reliance on the historical reliance on the mining economy, a planning system that responds to triggers in population growth rather than dates on a timeline. So, whilst I think that Westport's probably a good example of the continuation of that planning system, but it shouldn't beat ourselves up or beat WA up on, the encroachment of the existing port facility, because it's actually a pretty good system when compared to many others.
No, we are
nonsense. Let's beat them up.
but one thing I would like to just embellish a bit is, I suppose, the way that we've done the process. That's the other thing that's been quite different. So giving us a whole system to look at is the first part. The second part's been letting everyone come to the table and have a conversation. And I think the thing that governments forget, particularly in the infrastructure, particularly in the freight and logistics space, is that largely they don't operate or run a lot of the infrastructure. So to go away in a dark room and plan a new plan and then say to industry, here it is, aren't you pleased that we've done this work for you? And then go, well, hang on a minute, you forgot this, and what about that, and this isn't going to work. So the commitment we gave at the beginning was, let's get you to the table at the beginning, let's talk these things through, let's look at a huge list of options and throw some ideas around, and then let's keep you informed the whole way so you don't feel like. So the announcement has actually been far calmer than I expected. There's, with the exception of the unions who are concerned about changes to workforce, and there's some concerns about recreational fishing in the Sound, which we're going to be working through in terms of the environmental process and the social impact. But other than that, people kind of get it. They're like, okay, well, you've explained why. There's only so many ways we can cut this. And we're at a point now, actually, all the conversations I've had since the announcement have been so positive, because people are like, fantastic, now we know what's happening next. Right, can we do this now? Can we do that now? Now this is my piece of the puzzle. And the industry has come, to the table going, wonderful, we've been waiting for 15 years to invest. Now we know where we need to be. So I think that's the difference going forward with infrastructure. We can all quote projects that have kind of gone through the process and then been killed at the last minute because they haven't had a social license. And that extends to industry. Doing this with the right people around the table, I think, is the critical part of how infrastructure needs to be dealt with going forward. Because this political mandate, leadership from on high, that doesn't cut it anymore. The politicians don't have that level of support now to push through these big arguments. We have to bring everybody with us.
There was a bit of a segue there that I think I've lost, but you mentioned that you can't just write a plan and hand it over and expect it to be done. You'll understand the segue in a sec. You were involved, I guess, to some extent with the last version of the IA plan, which is being updated as we speak, I believe. Mountain of reforms in there that I guess they were accepted in principle. How do you feel jurisdictions have gone in terms of implementing them? Not just the big ones, not just road pricing, things like that. Has there been much progress in terms of adopting what's in there, and what do you think needs to be done if there hasn't?
Nicole, before you answer, Ilya, worst segue ever. That was like you changing gears in a manual car without a clutch, but I'll let it pass.
It's a hard one. Look, my view is that reform is difficult to implement from that point of view in terms of, I think the policy piece is important to educate and to sort of explain the issue. Actually implementing those things requires partnerships with the relevant jurisdictions, and it needs to be done mindful of a whole heap of contextual factors that they're dealing with in their own area. So I think two parts. One is, the plan came out last year. It hasn't probably had that much time yet to percolate prior to COVID hitting and things going. Sorry, the audit came out last year. The plan and how it evolves, I think, is the important part, because making sure that it's practical and workable and tangible is the challenge. Again, coming at it from the whole of the system perspective from on high when you don't have the levers.
Now, Nicole, we're quickly running out of time, and we always ask our guests one question, which allows us to compare and contrast between different people's views, and that is, what's your favourite sort of infrastructure and why?
And I have heard this question asked before, and I thought I must think about that in advance. That's a really hard one. And can I say it's not a form of infrastructure, it's actually a system. I think the thing for me is how these pieces fit together, because on their own, they're actually nothing. and one will enable another. And often, and I often say, a supply chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So it doesn't really matter what infrastructure you're talking about. If the bits that sit either side of it are not working, it doesn't function. So for me, I just want to see more system thinking, and I want to see us using these, levers properly, because at the moment, we're too much about thinking in silos and not enough about working together.
It's almost as if it needs some kind of strategy, some kind of state infrastructure strategy or something. I don't know.
Wouldn't that be a great idea? We should do one of those.
Someone should get on top of that.
Okay, I'll put it on my to-do list.
Please.
Well, it's a great note to finish on. Thank you very much for your insights and time, and thank you to Nicole Lockwood for coming on Inside Infrastructure.
Thank you both. It's been really enjoyable.
That's it for today. Please make sure you subscribe on your favourite podcast platform and leave us a rating or comment on LinkedIn. If you have any guest suggestions, then please feel free to send us those, either to Adrian or myself. We've certainly appreciated the messages we've been receiving so far. This episode was recorded and edited by Adam Stevens from TAG, PwC Australia's internal media agency. Research was conducted by Linda Bergeson, Brendan Pearce and Michael Player.